Yeah. So I wanted to cover a few case studies, some infrastructural case studies that scholars have done in order to expand on how you might sort of ask some infrastructural questions of your devices. And I know this is difficult because, you're coming up with these fictional devices or rebranded devices. It's almost easier if you're rebranding a device because you could kind of ask what is the surrounding infrastructure surrounding that device at the moment, and then how might you tweak that infrastructure to make that device better. If it's something like the amount of water that is needed to reproduce that device, you might want to think about how can we reduce the sort of water that making that device requires. Something like that. That might be an infrastructural intervention in your project that you might make. So I wanted to cover a few interesting cases. One is by Lisa Parks, who studies information technology in Macha, Zambia. And it's important to realize that there are still 3 billion people on the planet who do not have access to the internet. And sometimes getting that access is extremely hard. And this is complicated by an enduring imperialist sort of dynamic between rich and poor countries. She says that many Africans feel their communities have either become test sites for Westerners doing feel-good ICT research or a dumping ground for the West's digital hand-me-downs, old computers and printers shipped to Africa. So that's a problem in sort of these interactions in sort of setting up internet and how it's done and how it's done correctly or incorrectly. Internet access was first established in Macha, Zambia in 2004 through a satellite-dependent system at the community's Malaria Institute at Macha, or MIAM. And this was run by Johns Hopkins University. So shortly thereafter, a local organization called LinkNet formed, and with the support of the Dutch government, it developed rural internet services by installing cargo containers that were equipped with solar panels and satellite communication systems and computers in village sites, charging. And they set it up by charging fees through a voucher system. This charged nominal fees, but it couldn't support itself on these nominal fees, so it went bankrupt. So the system also did not work for a couple of reasons, which I do think have particular sort of come to bear, particularly in developing countries who are setting up access to internet. Oral culture. So many in Macha couldn't write or read in English, and the local language was not used in communicating the project to the community. Sounds like a really basic thing to kind of think about, but these people do kind of sort of in their readiness to kind of give internet access to a community, they sometimes tend not to think about some simple things. The project disproportionately favored the city center and didn't quite reach those outside of Macha. At the same time, 2 mobile phone companies came onto the scene with competitive pricing, so that played a role. There was a good deal of conflict between community leaders and LinkNet, so it's very important in setting up these systems to kind of communicate with the community in their language and in a productive way. The system automatically favored people with pre-existing technological training and didn't quite set up the infrastructure required to train people to sort of use technology to access the internet. And then finally, the electricity for Macha was mainly sort of sourced through hydro power plants. So there are regular interruptions depending on how much rain people got. And many things, like something like water has huge bearings on many facets of life. So Lisa Parks says that, found that one of the main status symbols in matcha was for people to buy a secondhand car from Japan. Like that was thought to be, whoa, you're doing well, you're pretty fancy. And the movement of water generates electricity that energizes the movement of data that allows the online transactions that result in the movement of a manufactured project from freeways in Japan all the way through to the dirt roads of Zambia. So, it's kind of like a butterfly effect in essence, of like one small thing can have huge sort of impacts on a community. That's one case study of how infrastructure sort of has huge effects on a community and their use of media. Now we're going to cover underwater internet cables, which is kind of a favorite topic of mine. I find it totally fascinating that these things exist underwater and give us the internet. It's kind of amazing. This was investigated by a researcher called Nicole Starosleski. People think of the internet as an abstract thing, but it's actually a massive cable systems on the ground and underneath the ocean. When you access the internet from your home, you access it from your router, sure, but at that point, moving forward, it's a web of wires and cables that are vulnerable to things like decay and natural disasters. So one example is Weta Workshop, and Weta is a media company in New Zealand who made the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and then since then have done a huge amount of work in special effects and sort of art sort of direction and art design of other films. So a lot of films in LA will outsource their art direction, production design, and special effects to Weta. One example of this is District 9, who kind of was involved in, who hired Weta to do their work. So Weta Workshop is a media production company, and it has massive files. Like if you imagine some of the fight scenes in Lord of the Rings, or just, one copy of Lord of the Rings that is a gonzo big file that Weta has to send from Wellington, New Zealand to LA. So what Weta did is they set up their own private undersea cable called the Fat Pipe, linking it directly to LA so that they can send these huge sized files. In terms of Australia and its cable systems, there are currently seven international submarine cables connected to Australia, to the rest of the world. And the major companies are Southern Cross Cable, which operates the Southern Cross Cable. Not much surprise there. The Pipe International, which operates PPC1, that's the name of the cable. Telstra, which operates the APNG2 and Telstra Endeavour cables. And then Synctel and Reach, which operate the COMU3100 cable. So these cables are entangled with content. For example, Fiji built its own fat pipe and started a film business in order to kind of populate that fat pipe. So existing infrastructure or future ones informed the kind of production of content and production projects of a country. Sometimes pipes are laid in accordance to big events like the Beijing Olympics. Cables are subject to all sorts of interference. They can be cut. Trawlers dragging nets can kind of interrupt them. Local projects can dig up stuff and accidentally dig up a cable. Sharks can kind of, go to town and bite through them. There's also a lot of cable theft that is done underwater in order to kind of use scrap metal value. So government surveillance occurs at the cable level. Keeping one's data in the cloud entails an increasing reliance on undersea cables and other international communications infrastructures to connect content that might have previously been locally available. And surveillance becomes even more murky when it becomes cheaper for countries to route their internet traffic through a third country than produce it purely in-house. So when companies do that, the thing is that flow of information to a third country party and back is subject to the government surveillance of that third party, right? So for example, NSA Sao Paulo, a internet company, buys internet from Miami and then directs it back to Sao Paulo. So they would be subject to the government surveillance happening in the United States. One example of how this might affect you is if you're using Dropbox to store your files, instead of keeping them on a local hard drive, you might very well be susceptible to a surveillance of foreign governments for how that sort of data is pinged back and forth, according to internet companies, and subject to data surveillance from local governments, their economic decisions, their policies about privacy, all of that. So, pretty interesting and important stuff that maybe you perhaps haven't really thought of until now. And the reason I place it sort of later on in the semester is because it's quite a big sort of shift in an understanding of a project, and it's something that can really sort of revitalize or kind of script your project in the last sort of span of time. If you kind of think about it this way, we started out with software and hardware and utopia, and it was big, and then we came into the user, and now we're getting big again before wrapping up. What does it have to do with your projects? So look at your device or your software program and ask, what existing infrastructure does it rely on? Who are the main sort of actors in this infrastructure? Is it government? Is it pipelines? Is it media companies? What surveillance potential is it subject to, and does it exert on its users? What companies would you need in order to set up what you're creating, hypothetically? How might underlying infrastructures actually be shaping your project that you hadn't thought of before? And if your project includes some sort of stance towards surveillance or climate change, you might want to seriously think about how the infrastructures around your project might be making a statement in and of themselves about climate change and surveillance. So you should maybe think about possible contradictions there between what you're proposing as something as like sort of a climate friendly program, and then potentially the sort of climate detractions that it has at an infrastructural level. So those are some questions that I would be thinking about were I you, regarding sort of infrastructure. Now, industry is sort of a little bit different. Industry studies sort of studies companies. It's kind of focused on the company itself and the inner workings of a company. But as you could see, sort of infrastructure and industry studies are quite interlinked. Infrastructure might be at a grander scale than industry studies, but they're still sort of pretty entangled. So if you want to research something like the main the main sort of media company that you would be interfacing with, like Netflix or something else, or Telstra, then you can kind of come at it with an industry studies sort of approach. But yeah, that's sort of industry and infrastructure. I hope that you found this interesting and it made you think about some things that maybe you hadn't considered before. I find it fascinating that all of our supposedly abstract sort of happenings and interactions with media all come down to like a mesh of cables that are kind of physical, and that can be cut and can be rerouted and can be surveyed, and all this stuff. Like, I find it's just kind of mind-blowing. So yeah, that's this sort of seminar. I hope you enjoy the Ramon Lobato reading, I really like Lobato because he's very clear in his writing, but he talks about sort of Netflix and VPNs and, how that system sort of, VPNs is a question of infrastructure that affects all of us. Those of you in China might be using a VPN now. Those of us who might be downloading stuff, probably using VPNs. We might be using VPNs to access American Netflix versus Australian Netflix. So it's a huge sort of presence in our lives that we might not necessarily think about in terms of how it affects our use of content and our consumption of content. So I hope you enjoy his chapter on that because it has immediate relevance to our lives, and we will talk about it in class. Okay, bye.